today so that more people all over can participate and hear the full speakers that we have. So I know that Christian has programmed this event very tightly, so I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming and welcome, and so happy to be here. And here's Christian.
Hi everyone, so thank you everyone for coming, Excellency, friends, ladies and gentlemen, and virtual online participants. I would like to first thank everyone for joining us here at the Yale Club and online virtually. And I'd like to convey my appreciation to the co-sponsors of this event, including Nuclear Peace Foundation, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, James Marshallese Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and the Prospect Hill Foundation. I would also like to acknowledge that today, very exciting, Matthew Spellberg, the new president of the Nuclear Peace Foundation, is here. It's actually right over there. As well as Penny Perjulo from and Rick Benetick of the Prospect Hill Foundation on this participants here. The number of people in attendance today reveals that youth engagement is critical in the field of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation affairs. Many young people are concerned about the continuous threat of nuclear weapons. Even one nuclear weapon is far too many. In recent years, youth have also been speaking out about climate change and have been demanding action from leaders, as this is also an existential threat that requires immediate action. Many of them are at COP26 now and are demanding action by their leaders. While youth are passionate about issues of nuclear weapons, climate change, the tools for effective mobilization between activists from both fields have been missing for years. Due to the urgent need for youth to collaborate, tackle the dire trends of both climate change and nuclear weapons, a group of youth came together and formed Reverse the Trend, with support from the Prospect Hill Foundation, Samuel Rubin Foundation, and our countless partners, including NAPF, Bomb Shelter, Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, Peace Boat US, IPPNW, and the Marshallese Educational Initiative. RCT amplifies the voices of young people, primarily coming from frontline communities, who have been directly affected by nuclear weapons and climate change. Our motto is that youth must rise up and take action to change the world. So once again, thank you all for your coming here, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. And I would like to give the floor back to Anya, who will introduce our first speaker. Thank you so much.
I would now like to welcome Ms. Soo-Hyun Kim from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, focal point for youth engagement, who will talk about the Youth for Disarmament Initiative.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, youth participants, and ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Reverse the Trend, the Prospect Hill Foundation, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, and the James Marshallese Center for Nonproliferation Studies for inviting me to address this event on youth initiative to reverse the trend of existential threats. Today's event takes place 75 years after the adoption of the first resolution of the UN General Assembly in 1946, which established the goal of eliminating all nuclear weapons and weapons adaptable to mass destruction. Since its establishment, the United Nations has been seeking to eliminate all weapons of mass destruction. It is embedded in the UN's DNA. Fast forward, our world faces multiple global challenges, from climate change to ensuring equitable and sustainable development for all, to the COVID-19 pandemic that continues to ravage communities across the globe. Yet the dangers posed by the continued existence of nuclear weapons must rank among the most urgent of those challenges. This is for one simple reason. Nuclear weapons remain the only weapon with the potential to eliminate all life on the planet. In his great work, The Outline of History, H.G. Wells wrote, "Human history becomes more and more a race between education and catastrophe." As we consider the devastating efforts of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons, it becomes quite clear that education will have a vital role to play, both in preventing arms races and in achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. So today, I would like to say a few words about how what we are doing in the United Nations for Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA, to promote disarmament and non-proliferation education by placing youth engagement at its core. We believe it is essential to hear the voices of this generation, the largest generation in history, and to talk with its members about disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. Young people under the age of 30 account for over half of the world's population, and we can't achieve disarmament nor world peace without their engagement. Recognizing the importance of young people in bringing about change, UNODA launched its youth outreach initiative, #YouthNumber4Disarmament, in 2019 to engage, educate, and empower young people and facilitate their meaningful participation in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation. Later that year, the UN General Assembly reaffirmed the contributions that young people can make in sustaining peace and security. In spite of the constraints posed by the global pandemic, we were able to make significant inroads in reaching out to this new generation. UNODA created and launched a dedicated digital platform for youth engagement at www.youthnumber4disarmament.org. Please allow me to share 3 examples of Youth for Disarmament's recent work. First, hosting a first-of-its-kind training program with 10 UN youth champions, with generous financial contributions by Germany. They received a year-long training on general principles of disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control through both online courses and exchanges with experts from think tanks, civil society organizations, and the diplomatic field, and developed and implemented projects to engage their communities on disarmament-related issues. 4 UN Youth Champions for Disarmament delivered remarks to the formal plenary of the Conference on Disarmament under the presidency of Canada on 2021 International Youth Day. A second example is the Youth Forum on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, co-organized with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea earlier this year in June, which resulted in the adoption of the Seoul Youth Declaration. And through that declaration, we are implementing peer-to-peer education, which I think there's a lot of potential and power in this. Also convening a disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control, or D.N.A, DNA workshop and development for young leaders was held in partnership with Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, with further sessions in the works to explore the connections between DNA and environment and climate action. Last item on the list is holding 2 worldwide contests called the 75 Words for Disarmament Youth Challenge and the What If Spestera Hopeland Video Challenge, and conducting 2 campaigns, the Step Up for Disarmament Youth Campaign to raise awareness of young people for the International Day Against Nuclear Tests on 29 August 2021. And the #Youth in Action for Disarmament campaign, inviting young people to showcase their activities, which will run until 12 December. By providing on a range of activities, whether it be tapping into individuals' artistic talents or through physical activity, be it virtual, in person, or hybrid, young people of all interests, expertise, and backgrounds have been invited to participate in disarmament efforts, forging a community of young people actively and passionately working within the disarmament field. Together with youth-led organizations and our partners, like the RTT, we will continue to provide creative and action-oriented educational activities and practicums, inviting youth with a variety of interests to meaningfully participate and contribute to securing our common future. Education is, as H.G. Wells suggested, one of humanity's greatest assets in the race to prevent future catastrophes, and this is nowhere truer than with respect to the need to prevent any future use of nuclear weapons. I hope today's event will generate some new ideas on how UNODA can further contribute to this great cause, and we stand ready to work with all of you as we confront the new challenges that lie ahead. On behalf of UNODA and its #YouthNumber4Disarmament initiative, I thank you so much.
Thank you, Sue. Next, we will hear from Ambassador Marisa Chan, the Deputy Permanent Representative of Costa Rica. She will focus on her discussion on military expenditures on nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank Rivers and Friend, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Prospect Hill Foundation, the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and the Marshallese Educational Initiative for this opportunity. At the outset, let me highlight some facts about the world we live in. According to ICANN, the 9 nuclear weapon states collectively spent more than $70 billion on nuclear weapons in 2020. 27.7 billion of which went to a dozen defense contractors to build nuclear weapons. Those contractors then spent 117 million lobbying policymakers and up to $10 million funding think tanks writing about nuclear weapons. Simply put, the 9 nuclear weapon states spend every minute close to $100,000 in nuclear weapons. Similarly, the global campaign on military spending calculates that the annual nuclear weapon budget worldwide is 1,000%, or 10 times, the combined budget of both the UN and the WHO. A nuclear weapons explosion would have an immediate and devastating effect on SDGs, which are already lagging in many respects. Thus, the effort to ban nuclear weapons is a clear contribution to the SDGs, as it eliminates one of the major threats to their implementation. Meeting the 2030 agenda and the 17 goals will cost the world $2 to $3 trillion per year. But unlike excessive military expenditure, what states spend on these goals contribute concretely to the human security of their citizens. There is a cost of opportunity if we continue on this course. At the international level, for instance, we could be investing more than $70 billion a year, or $100,000 per minute, to address climate change, the other existential threat to humanity. As we're having lunch today, COP26 is taking place in Glasgow. 12 years ago, the United Nations Climate Summit in Copenhagen, developed countries made a significant pledge. They promised to channel $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. That promise was broken. And yet, compared with the investment required to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, the $100 billion pledge is minuscule. It is well known that the climate finance agenda is not only a fundamental feature of support for developing countries towards a transition to decarbonization and resilience, but also a trust-building exercise in climate change negotiations regime. COP26 outcome needs to include a comprehensive set of deliverables on climate finance, including adaptation finance, support for loss and damage, and market mechanisms designed to transport the economy and put on track to deliver on the 1.5 target. Nuclear weapons and climate change are 2 of the most pressing issues of our time. It is imperative that we address these threats simultaneously. We have the moral, political, legal responsibilities to protect human rights, protect our environment, promote sustainable development, and ensure that we leave behind a decent and livable global society for future generations. Not only do nuclear weapons endanger the non-negotiable right to life, but they also endanger the rights to health, housing, development, food, and the right to be free from discrimination, just to name a few. We must change the narrative that nuclear weapons are a symbol of sovereignty, bring security, and promote stability and peace. In reality, we are living in a world that is very insecure, unstable environment, above all, due to actual and potential disruption by nuclear weapons and climate change. A human rights approach and a feminist approach can help change that narrative. Human rights are about the rights of individuals, not states. Ultimately, too, they are about the well-being of society and peoples. They deeply connect to foundational international instrument, among others, the UN Charter, which begins "we the peoples," and the Nonproliferation Treaty, which refers to safeguarding the security of peoples. Costa Rica has also called for a feminist approach to nuclear disarmament, which challenges the outdated assumption that power competition is the only way to conduct foreign relations and ensure national security. Contrary to that statement, we affirm that cooperation, solidarity, and a commitment to human security represent the only sustainable path forward. Further, the Treaty on the Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons invokes human rights and protects the rights of victims of nuclear weapons testing and use. And let's not forget that its acknowledgement of the gender dimension of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Ban Treaty is lauded as the only gender-sensitive nuclear weapons agreement into existence. With the NPT Review Conference and the first meeting of state parties of the TPNW lying before us in 2022, I urge states to integrate the imperative of non-use and elimination of nuclear weapons with protection of human rights, a feminist approach, care for the environment, the promotion of sustainable development, and human security. We cannot wait any longer. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chan. It's always a pleasure to hear the input of people who are working on the world stage for non-proliferation and other disarmament efforts. Every dollar being put into maintaining nuclear weapons is a dollar not being used towards improving the lives of citizens throughout the world. A large part of why young people, including myself, get involved in such programs is to try to build a better future. Imagine the future that can be built with those billions of dollars being invested. We shouldn't despair though. In 2017, states and civil societies came together to create an international legal instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. This instrument, known as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, entered into force in January this year. The first meeting of states and parties will be held in Vienna, Austria. On that note, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Marshallese, the permanent representative of Austria. He will talk about why it matters that these activists are part of TPNW negotiations.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear friends, here in the room, Christian, thank you very much. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thanks for the invitation. It's very refreshing to have an in-person encounter, especially given the access limitations that we have for civil society at the UN headquarters, something we hope will change soon. Exchanges with civil society is something that we Austrians treasure very much in the past, and we will continue to advocate for that for all issues and in all fora. On disarmament, whether it's the first committee, the NPT review conference, or the first meeting of the states parties of the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, in March of next year in Vienna. My short intervention today is on the topic, why has youth involvement in the TPNW matter, and why will it continue to do so as we move towards the implementation? Well, as a very short answer. Youth engagement is key on all issues that affect the future. Therefore, it's always clearly logical and necessary for youth to be involved in disarmament and on youth to be involved on the implementation of the TPNW. Let me explain. Member states' delegations reflect positions of their current governments. When we deal with projects that concern the future, and many topics that we address at the UN, they deal with the future. It becomes clear that it is important that the positions that the government holds also continue on beyond the government in power at the moment, but that it would also get the support of future, the buy-in and the understanding, support of future generations. And so, if we take the TPNW and have a look at how the TPNW started. Civil society participation, including youth participation, was key at the negotiating conference. If you look at the pictures from the conference back then, many delegates, especially from civil society such as NAPF or ICANN, were young people. And there was much contribution by youth organizations directly. They brought the interest, urgency, dedication, but also expertise, novel concepts, new ideas, and a commitment for the future to transcend the current system and the current power structures into the whole TPNW process. And they also worked really, really hard. This input informed the views of the delegates, reassured us all that the project that we were working on also had the support and buy-in of the next generation. And this gave us the determination to see this project through and helped us shape the TPNW into its current form. So what does this mean? One really important thing, please continue to be involved. Continue to make your voices heard. Young people have much more influence than they sometimes realize. Look at COP26 that we're currently seeing. It's a great example of the immense power that youth actually has. Uniting under the banner of Fridays for Future, youth was present everywhere. Politicians, diplomats, delegates, everyone knows today that this is an issue that the next generation takes extremely seriously. Such active involvement by young people would also benefit other issues, such as another existential threat to humanity, the existence of nuclear weapons. It used to be a big topic in the 1960s and 70s. Today, it has somehow slipped out of the daily news and the daily discussions. It doesn't feature prominently in school and university curricula. Young people aren't interested, if you compare it to some of the other interests that were generated by international challenges like climate. Somehow, there's also a feeling that nuclear weapons are just simply there. We can't do anything really about it. There is an air of defeatism. I've heard some cynics say that it's going to take a detonation of a nuclear device by accident or by design to change this attitude and permit progress on nuclear disarmament. Waiting for disaster is no strategy. That is not something we can accept. Anyone who survived or studied the humanitarian consequences of a nuclear detonation cannot accept such a nihilist approach. Our generation, my generation, heard the terrifying testimonies of the Hibakusha. It will soon be up to the younger generations to carry their torch, to use their memories as guidance for effort to come. Disarmament conferences, meetings of this kind, can serve this purpose, a purpose of bringing momentum to intergenerational dialogue. And we want to have this also at the first meeting of states parties to the TPNW. Like the negotiation of the treaty, its implementation is a concern for all of us. And I invite youth organizations and young delegates and young experts to take part at that meeting in Vienna and join us there to work on the implementation. We need your voices, especially on some of TPNW's unique features. Obligations such as victim assistance and environmental remediation are forward-looking in nature. They need the input of your generation. Youth engagement for nuclear disarmament will be vital if we ever really want to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. I've been in this business for quite a while, and sometimes I hear from other colleagues, why do you Austrians still get so worried about nuclear weapons? They've been around. You should accept them. Stop the fuss. Having nuclear weapons isn't the end of the world. Well, with nuclear weapons involved, it may well be. My hope is that with your active support, we will be able to prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It is refreshing to hear a representative talk about the importance of involving young people in the discussion around the TPNW and other disarmament issues. We will now learn about the legacy of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands from Ambassador Amatlain Elizabeth Kabua, the permanent representative of the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Mayor. Excellencies, distinguished guests, organizer, present your team, Benetick. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank you, Chris, and the organizer, as well as the other speakers for addressing the key issue of youth involvement in disarmament. I am pleased to share with you the important perspective of the Marshall Islands in addressing these issues. As many of you know, the involvement of the Marshallese in addressing the devastating impact of nuclear testing in our islands at the United Nations is not at all a recent undertaking, but one which dates back to the time of the testing itself. What is now RMI, that's the acronym for Republic of the Marshall Islands, was once part of the United Nations Strategic Trust Territory of the Pacific. The United States was the UN's administrating authority, which meant that ultimately it was the responsibility of the UN to guide and oversee our social and economic development, our human rights and well-being until such time as independence was achieved. The UN, and through it, the US, acting as the UN administrating authority, conducted 67 large-scale nuclear weapon tests over 12 years, from 1946 to 1958, daily. Maybe it wasn't fully understood that this was at the time, but the UN Trusteeship Council made some grave errors in allowing testing to commence and to proceed over the formal objections of the Marshallese people in our petition to halt testing in 1954 and in 1956. At that time, Marshallese were not just passive victims, but seeking a role of active agents of our own future. And throughout the decades, it has been Marshallese voices and local communities which have continually raised alarm and attention to the wrongs which needed to be righted. We don't have time at today's meeting to fully understand the history and contemporary challenges, but these tests produce a complex legacy. Over the subsequent decades, many Marshallese communities wrestled with and negotiated how to clean up what was safe and how would the law be addressed. And today, we are still wrestling with these profound challenges. I'm going off script, but I wanted to know that some of the islands that were tested on are no more there. And the people that were the victim continue to be nomad in their own country because there is no place to be. It's all just ocean. So these are the things that we're also fighting to see how we can write this. So are the women that have been producing different kind of human-like babies. The reproductive system has been really challenged. And we have no medical know-how to seek this kind of a remedial to help them. The same thing with our legacy of cancer, various cancer, people are still dying because we have thyroid cancer, we have ovarian cancer, you name it, we have it. So this is what I want to also just put in my, as an example. So we don't have the time at, so in 2013, the United Nations Special Rapporteur is like an independent investigator for human rights and hazardous waste visited our nation and produced findings that urge action from both the US and the international community, including the UN, to please help. And he also found that the Marshallese government had our own voice and role to play in progressing the human rights of our own citizens, including being an effective advocate. Our government continues to maintain the primary responsibility falls upon the United States. We are simply not prepared to accept any treaty or agreement which says otherwise. Our views on this are well known to others in the TPNW negotiations. But at the same time, we must ultimately own this legacy rather than letting this legacy own us. It is important to acknowledge that measures to address testing impact have been taken by the United States, but those measures remain inadequate. We will never fail to continue to hold them account, and we will never cease to remind the United Nations of its own grave mistakes during our trusteeship. And it is also important that we continue to develop young Marshallese talent, including scientists, medical professionals, so that we can help make our own assessment on what is safe or what isn't, instead of having to rely on outside authorities, which we sometimes might struggle to understand or trust. I'm saying this because we have various experts and scientists that came in and say, oh, your islands are safe, you can go back. And they came back and said, no, it's not. Because people were really like dying of different cancer because they were exposed to cesium on the dirt, on the fertile the land. So the food crop from fish to whatever coconut, that's one of the mainstay in the islands, were contaminated. So so indeed, our National Commission has been really working with stakeholders to come up with planning goals and specifics to see if we can take this forward. We have over history and into the future never failed to remind the international community of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon use. No other nation or people should ever have to bear our same burdens. It is important to reflect on our history, the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, which is continued in 1963 through the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which all the major powers signed up to. And this treaty was designed in large part to do the attention given to our voices. We and others continue to remind the world of the importance of avoiding such consequences. And yet, we all continue to live within the risk, with the risk. Next January, nations are due to meet yet again under the Nonproliferation Treaty to inch towards progress. And as the Marshall Islands, we will never be silent in reminding the world of why nuclear weapon should never be used again. I thank you so very much for this opportunity. Since we do the organizer, this is an opportunity to share with you our very sad, long saga of history that never really had any closure. But thank you for your support and the opportunity to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It is always important to hear the stories. To expand further on the tragic history of nuclear testing, we will hear from Dr. Ivana Hughes, who is the director of K+1 Center for Nuclear Studies at Columbia University. Good afternoon.
And let me just begin by saying how honored I am to be speaking after all of the distinguished guests that we have heard from today, and how thankful I am to Christian and all of the other organizers for putting this group of people together and for including me in the event. Christian asked me to speak about our work at Columbia University on ascertaining radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands. And I'm going to make my remarks a little bit more personal. I'm going to actually talk about the ways in which we got some youth involved in this, and share 3 stories about both how this work began and kind of where the work took us. But I'm going to also define first what I mean when I say our work. And for most people, all of you, I'm sure, in your own work, you feel like you work with lots of different people, and so you're often describing our work. When I say our, there's a little bit more meaning to it in that this really has been the work that my husband, who's sitting in the room here, and I have been doing together. And it was actually his idea back in 2011 when he was teaching a course that was required of all Columbia undergraduates. It was his idea to, in a unit that was meant to address physics, modern physics topics, it was his idea to put in a lecture about nuclear weapons. And both of us, I direct the same course, and both of us were really like 10 years ago, just absolutely astounded both by the threat that nuclear weapons continue to pose to the world, and yet how little the younger generation, the students at Columbia University, right here in New York City, we have some of the most wonderful students in the world, and they knew so little, and that just frightened us, and it frightened Amatlain, and it got us to thinking about how do we get something going, how do we get young people involved in thinking about this issue. We started with a series of kind of summer programs where students worked on different projects, and fast forward from 2011 to 2014, we spent the summer at Stanford University where Amatlain was doing some fundamental physics research, and we brought along 3 students whom we tasked with trying to learn from people who were active in this field, both sort of scholars and activists, trying to learn what's happening currently in the nuclear weapons world, and to actually make a short documentary about it. And the students traveled, one of the first things they did is they went to Santa Barbara and visited a Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and they learned very quickly from David Krieger, the past president, we have Matthew here today, with us, who told him about the Marshallese nuclear zero lawsuits. And at the time, the Marshall Islands had filed lawsuits both in US court against the United States, but also in international court against other nuclear weapon states for their failure to comply with the Article 6 of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, for their failure to negotiate in good faith towards total and complete disarmament, which of course to this day has not happened. And so our students learned about this and came to us very excitedly. And Emlyn and I were sitting in a meeting with them back when in-person meetings were a regular thing. They, there was so much passion in them really wanting to learn about this topic as much as possible. And at one point in that conversation, Emlyn said, well, maybe we could figure out a way to go to the Marshall Islands. And I mean, I cannot describe to you the excitement in their eyes. And so we, went on and continued the meeting. And after the meeting was finished, I turned to Emlyn, students had left. I turned to Emlyn and I said, well, now you're going to have to take them to the Marshall Islands. You just you just dangle that in front of them. You're going to have to do it. So fast forward a few weeks later, when they had in fact made a trip, at the time Emlyn and I had 3 very young children. Well, we still have 3 children, but they're not very young anymore. And so he was the one who traveled with the 3 students to Madura, and they spent a week there, meeting many wonderful people, learning about many of the sad stories, as we already heard, related to the nuclear legacy. And when they came back, it was almost as if Emlyn and I had barely greeted each other. And he wanted to tell me one of the things that happened. And he described a conversation that the 4 of them had with a senator from Rongelap Atoll, who was 2 years old at the time. His name is Jaban Ricklin. He was 2 years old at the time of the Bravo test. And Emlyn said that students had asked him about his experience, and he talked and he told them all these things. And Emlyn said, and at one point towards the end, I asked him, and Rongelap Atoll is among the atolls that the ambassador mentioned that are not yet resettled. Emlyn said, well, who would you trust to tell you if your island is safe? And he said the senator's response was, I don't know. And Emlyn said, I just cannot get that I don't know out of my head. I can't get it out of my head. We have to do something. And that's really how, that was the impetus for trying to figure out, he's a physicist who worked in many different fields of physics. I'm a chemist. This wasn't our expertise. The idea was to figure out how to go there and how to make these measurements. And that's really what we ended up doing. And so fast forward about 10 months later, when we were now planning to make our first trip to the Northern Marshall Islands to make measurements of what is referred to as background gamma radiation. So this is radiation from the isotopes in the environment that you would get exposed to if you're just walking around an area. And so I was sitting in an office. We were meeting with the students every morning at 9 a.m. for an hour, making plans and so on. At some point after lunch, I was sitting in my office doing some work, and one of the students came in almost in alarm and said to me, I have been reading Department of Energy reports. This is the US Department of Energy. And I don't know why we're going. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I'm reading all of this and we're not going to find anything. We're going to find 0 radiation levels. There will be no radiation. That's what they say. The measurements should be 0. She had just been actually calibrating our instruments. And so she really knew what was going on. And I said, well, that would be wonderful. let's go and let's find zero and let's tell people, actually, it's zero, you know, it looks great. Needless to say, we did not find, despite Jill's concern, we did not find zero radiation for the background gamma measurements. We found it in Bikini Island, where most of the tests were done. Many of the very high energy yield tests were done in Bikini. We found levels of radiation that far exceed the agreement between the US and the Marshallese governments about what total radiation could be. And on subsequent trips, we also found that isotopes, radioactive isotopes in the food also actually broke limits, exceeded limits, not just by the various international and national standards, but also even some of the fruits, even the most permissive radiation levels by the US FDA. And so, you know, I guess I could talk more about what we found, and I don't want to take your time. The point is, what can we learn from the Marshall Islands legacy? I strongly believe that it is not just the legacy of the Marshall Islands, it is also the legacy of all of us who call ourselves Americans, and we have a responsibility to help. I also personally believe that the US owes the Marshallese an apology, but I think that we need to get our youth to be brave, to be bold, to go out there, to go learn about the world, and to really help bring nuclear weapons to history and help us move on in a world that's free and safe and peaceful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes. I greatly appreciate the two distinguished individuals who explained the humanitarian and also environmental impact of nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands remain a modern example of the dangers of nuclear weapons. Our next speaker, Benetick Kabua Maddison, understands this firsthand. Benetick Maddison is a project specialist on youth, climate, and nuclear issues at the Marshallese Educational Institute, and an advisor to reverse the trend. The Marshallese Educational Institute is a not-for-profit organization located in Springdale, Arkansas, with the highest concentration of Marshallese in the continental United States. Benetick will talk about A Journey Home, a community poem by a group of Marshallese youth. This poem was produced under Reverse the Trend and edited by Lovely Umanxis of Momchilta.
Yale, greetings. I want to thank Christian Ciobanu for the invitation and the organizers for the opportunity to participate in today's event. It is an honor to speak on the same platform with speakers doing important work concerning youth involvement in disarmament. When the nuclear testing program started in 1946, we were all alone. No one stood by us and no one defended us. These words were stated by Marshall Islands President Davis Kabua in his statement for the National Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day on March 1st this year. Today, the Marshallese people have allies worldwide who share the same aspirations for nuclear justice and a nuclear-free world. And how did we end up with friends near and far? It is because of the personal stories our ancestors and grandparents shared with others about their firsthand experiences with nuclear testing, and my fellow Marshallese in the islands, states, and elsewhere who are raising awareness about the nuclear disruption on Marshallese bodies and lands. Unfortunately, like most Marshallese youth in the Marshall Islands, Those here in the United States are not fully aware of their nuclear legacy. A legacy that continues to be filled with lies and censorship, even though the nuclear testing program ended 6 decades ago. In high school, I remember my Marshallese classmates and I flipping through our American history textbooks. The only images of mushroom clouds we saw were the bombs detonated on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I asked my teacher, where are the images of the 67 nuclear weapons that were detonated in the Marshall Islands? He did not know how to answer. The only mention of the Marshall Islands in the textbook was how the United States liberated the islands from the Japanese. So being seen as saviors, but not taking ownership of the atrocities they committed on Marshallese bodies and lands. This horrendous chapter must be taught to the American public because the US nuclear testing program in the Marshall Islands is and will always be a part of American history. Unsurprisingly, the United States government still refuses to release all classified and redacted documents that we have been asking for decades. Although Marshallese know more about the nuclear testing program than our ancestors and grandparents did last century, there is still a lot more that we don't know. The slow trickle of information about the nuclear testing program has contributed to, as mentioned earlier, to Marshallese youth not being well versed in the nuclear legacy that continues to impact us, our people, and our homeland. To fill in the gap, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, MEI, has held workshops and community events to educate the Marshallese community, particularly the Marshallese youth, about the nuclear testing program's ongoing biological and ecological effects. In June, MEI held the Youth Day as part of a 3-day event to commemorate the first nuclear test in the Marshall Islands on July 1st, 1946, on Bikini Atoll, where 23 nuclear weapons were detonated between 1946 and 1958, including Castle Bravo. Before testing nuclear weapons, the United States asked the locals on Bikini Atoll to use their homeland to test nuclear weapons. Like most people at the time, the Marshallese did not know what nuclear weapons were, nor their destructive capabilities. Then on March 7, 1946, 167 Bikinians were removed from their lands, not knowing what or when they would ever return to their pristine paradise. My father's mother is one of the original 167 Bikinians who were removed. My grandmother was only 2 years old at the time, but she has not returned to her birthplace and ancestral homeland since she left because Bikini is unsafe for people to live on. Though we do not commemorate the first test every year, the Marshall Islands has a day designated for remembering the nuclear victims and survivors called Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day. Our 75th anniversary of the first test was an opportunity to bring together Marshallese youth to learn and reflect on the consequences that our people and islands must live with for quite a long time. Consequences that nobody deserves to experience, which are not taught in the classroom, but must be. Students who attended the event had the opportunity to hear from Kristen Siobanu, and who's also with Reverse the Trend, about the work of the 2 organizations and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They also heard from Honorable Consul General El Benali, who encouraged them to dig into the past and share our nuclear stories with others. We're also fortunate to have Ariana Piban, who works with the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission, to share an extensive and well-informed presentation about nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. Ariana and the NNC are leading efforts to educate Marshallese students across the Marshall Islands about the nuclear history. MEI has also held art workshop, and students created a mural to present earlier this year at the Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day on March 1st. The mural is that of the Castle Bravo, which was detonated in Bikini Atoll on March 1st, 1954. It was the most powerful nuclear device tested by the United States And based on the stories of those who were alive that day, they thought it was the end of time. The late climate ambassador of the Marshall Islands, Tony DeBrun, once recalled, "When I was 9 years old, I remember well the 1954 Bravo shot at Bikini Atoll, the largest detonation the world had ever seen, 1,000 times the power of the Hiroshima blast. It was the morning and I was fishing with my grandfather. He was throwing the net and suddenly the silent bright flash. And then the force, the shockwave. Everything turned red, the ocean, the fish. And we were 200 miles away from ground zero, a memory that can never be erased." After the detonation, a nearby community on Rongelap Atoll was exposed to nuclear fallout from the Castle Bravo. Children played in the powder, thinking it was snow, and people's hairs were falling out and developed skin burns. Later, women would be giving birth to jellyfish babies. The Marshall Islands have some of the highest rates of cancers in the world. The destruction of land with nuclear weapons meant that Marshallese had to shift from their healthy diet to importing food from the outside world. Rice, ramen, canned food, and other unhealthy diets that contribute to the high rates of diabetes and other diseases or nuclear-related diseases killing our people. Our ancestors lived into their hundreds, but their descendants are dying young. In addition to learning about the nuclear history in the Marshall Islands and its impact, Marshallese students also participated in several workshops with Christian Siobanu and lovely Umaya of the Bombshell Zone, who was also part of the Reverse the Trend. The Reverse the Trend is a project that helps educate young people worldwide about the relationship between nuclear and climate issues and their effects on frontline communities. At the end of the writing workshop, 6 Marshallese youth in Arkansas wrote a poem called A Journey Home, which we will hear at the end. It is a poem that reflects on the different places that each of them calls home, whether it be Arkansas, the Marshall Islands, or our planet. 20,000 Marshallese reside in Arkansas, with the largest population in Springdale. Like my family and I, many love the Marshall Islands for the United States, for employment, education, health, and other reasons. The Springdale School District alone has 3,000 Marshallese students. Some of them moved from the islands when they were young. Others have not visited the islands, and many have a lot to learn about their history and culture. The Marshallese Educational Initiative, the Reverse the Trend, and our partners will continue to work with Marshallese youth to educate them about the devastating consequences our people and islands are still facing. The Marshallese people have yet to achieve nuclear justice, so the fight must continue, which continues with the young generation through raising awareness and working together. After 75 years since the first nuclear test in the Marshall Islands, there is still more work to do to prevent the use of and abolish nuclear weapons for good. Komoi, thank you.
A journey home. My feet move through fresh mud after the rain. Spring leaves crunch under my shoes. Careful not to step on the many-legged creatures that call this place home. Clouds appear when I breathe out. This earth is my home too. I find new paths every day, souls full of memories that I have made. Home is in the stillness of trees that flank the rugged road winding into miles and miles of breathtaking wild. Home is in the loud hooting during football games, woo, pig, suey, and the crisp hiss of a soda can pried open on a summer day. Home is in the riot of my bedroom, where purple string lights dangle like dancing punk fairies as I sing along loops of my favorite songs. I find home when I travel, like that one time in Seattle, a city that smells of brine brewed from the sea. Skinned fish and homemade cheese sit pretty under the patter of rain and the squabble of seagulls bathing in the bay. But there is one home I long for, the Marshall Atolls, daughters of the ocean, forged by primordial coral. They call my name. My feet move through the sand, damp from the waves. They pull me. Palms seek the cool touch of sea foam like delicate lace. These islands are my inheritance, earthly gems under opulent stars. But I cannot walk further. The water is a terrifying mood, eating away the island lagoons, seawalls battered, now crumbling. Storms split the leaning palms, the same ones swallowed by nuclear plumes many years ago. Men gave atom bombs a place in world history. But what about this home? Smudged out of the story, I fear people only saw the dirty red cloud and not the bruised earth below. In the future, will these island daughters sink to the ocean floor? I fear people only see a drowned land instead of an earth worth saving. These questions stump me, but still I stitch a map to connect what matters most. My family, my culture, my Marshall Island home. A map of the Marshalls, not as a place, but a people to guide a future generation whose feet will meet the islands with love and without fear. But I long to find a path towards home, the emerald countryside or the blue Pacific tides that will stay safe, where my children can tumble into a beautiful brightness and feel earth as stable bedrock under their newly formed souls, while their little palms, fingers splayed, reach for the sky, a limitless canvas where time is constant and still.
Okay, hello everyone, to those who are tuning in from different locations around the world, and also those who are in New York right now. I wish I can be with all of you in person under different circumstances, but nonetheless, I am so glad that you've joined us for this event. So my name is Lovely Umayam. I'm a nuclear policy expert, writer, and a collaborator of Reverse the Trend. It has been an absolute joy to see Reverse the Trend transition from an idea on a piece of paper and into a full-fledged, expansive network of dedicated diplomats, activists, policy experts like myself, and most importantly, the youth members, which, all came together amidst the pandemic. So I'm just really in awe of this group for flourishing and getting things done despite the challenges that we've all experienced. So to those who do not know me and my role, I'm mainly involved in Reverse the Trend as the organizer of the docuseries program. And to briefly describe it, the docuseries is a series of virtual writing workshops for Reverse the Trend youth members in high school and college. And during these workshops, we hang out over Zoom, get to know each other, and write creatively about the impact of nuclear weapons and climate change in our communities. We piloted the docuseries this past spring in Springdale, Arkansas, with a group of Marshallese youth, who I now call my friends, and I hope they say the same about me. And the outcome of our time together is this beautiful community poem called A Journey Home, and it is now published in Outrider magazine. and it is soon to be an animated video under the direction of Catherine Killow, who you'll be hearing from shortly. And what I really want to touch on today in this message is the process of connecting with these youth members and how this experience really reinvigorated my commitment to nuclear policy. So while I've had a wonderful, successful career doing nuclear policy research in a wide range of roles, including government, academia, and NGO, I've really found that operating in these professional spaces can sometimes push down or push back or push away the why. We sort of get wrapped up in the day-to-day stresses and meetings such that the goal starts to fade in the backdrop. And personally, it's very important for me as a policy expert to carve out spaces to reconnect with that goal, to make it personal again. And to be honest, that's getting harder and harder, right? Like millions of young people in this world, you know, I do not hold the personal memory of witnessing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I, as an older millennial, still don't have the memory or don't remember the Cold War. And although we now live in a world where these traumas can be easily repeated, that this history can be easily repeated, I do not have a direct reference point of how painful or scary that history was. And I really believe that we have to create new reference points to make this personal and to make it urgent. And I think the docuseries, you know, did that for me as an experience, as a community experience, beyond the conversations around disarmament and deterrence and modernization and nonproliferation, which can feel so abstract, especially for young people. Meeting the young folks over spring, Marcina, Trina, Benetick, Moni, Joyce, Daphne, and then hearing their stories about how they wrestle with nuclear testing legacy while being away from their native home, and then worrying about the impact of climate change here in the United States where they live in Arkansas, as well as the Pacific, that feels so much more palpable to me. And what motivates me to do my research and my advocacy and my art is to make sure that, one, we address that intergenerational harm, and two, to really make sure it never happens to anybody else. So the last thing I'll say is that as I learned from them, I hope that they've also learned from me. I see this docuseries as a skill building exercise, but not in a sense that we learn statistics or theories or activist strategies, but rather we hone skills that are more fundamental. We learn how to express ourselves and share our voices because public speaking and writing are essential to activism and policymaking. It's about building confidence by creating a space where everyone's experience is honored, including providing them with honest feedback. We think creatively together, and I hope that by sharing my experience as a nuclear policy researcher, that I've shown them a possible entry point to this kind of work, should they wish to pursue it. It's very difficult to find mentors or anyone really who's actually in this line of work. So I see that as a resource as well. And I guess lastly, by transforming their poetry into a visual piece through Catherine's animation, we learn that the message can manifest in different forms of media to achieve larger outreach and emotional range. So I guess this is all to say that the docuseries is a true mutual exchange and collective effort. And I'm very lucky to have younger colleagues to help me realign with why I do this. I am very lucky to have artist colleagues like Catherine to push me to think creatively about these types of projects. And lastly, just very grateful to Reverse the Trend for making this possible. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.
Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Killo, and I'm an artist collaborator working with lovely Umayim of Bombshell Toe Policy Arts Collective. I'm sorry I can't meet you all in person, but I'm really thankful for this opportunity through Reverse the Trend to say a few words about the creative process of animating a journey home. I truly consider the making of this animation as much a learning process as I do a project. When Lovely first shared the poem with me and approached me about the docuseries, I was really in awe of the imagery that was so vivid but relatable, the flow and rhythm of the poem, which I think compels a lot of us to read it out loud, and the story itself, which reflects multiple experiences of our young Marshallese writers, but all through a really connective and unifying journey. So turning a poem like this into an animation, it's been a really exciting and daunting challenge. My interpretation of the visual elements is thankfully largely inspired by conversations with some of the writers who were so kind as to go into greater detail with me about their memories. I really hope that we honored their work. I also truly believe that creativity is a living process, and I know that it's not just contained in this one animation. So I hope it sparks further creativity and other artistic pieces. I think that art, which has been developed in collaboration like this poem through Lovely's workshops, her mentorship, and the students' personal writing, which is a practice that requires a lot of time and energy and self-reflection, it offers us all a much more real understanding of nuclear issues and how they reverberate from one diasporic community to another. So it was important that I come into this project not just as an animator, but also as a student, to learn more about Marshallese history and the Marshallese community in Springdale. So I'll just end by saying credit really goes to Lovely for enabling this kind of creative process that centers community building. And it's especially important in the work, the realm of policy work. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that you enjoy and share the poem, A Journey Home. Thank you.
Introducing the two main drafters of this year's youth statement to the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, Jeremiah Williams and Taylor Leigh Magnus of Pace University. A theme throughout this event has been the importance of involving young people in the conversations around disarmament. That is why the work of these two to bring young voices directly to the attention of the First Committee is so important.
Thank you very much for allowing us to speak today and talk about our experiences with disarmament education. My name is Taylor Magnus, and I am an undergraduate student studying political science at Pace University. Today, young people face many challenges accessing disarmament and non-proliferation policymaking, even though we make up 40% of the world's population. The vastly different ways in which we experience the world are largely impacted by the reality that we face in our encounters with violence. These encounters include the decisions about where weapons are in relation to marginalized communities, and the problems that can occur within the maintenance of weapons. It wasn't until my junior year of high school in my International Baccalaureate program's European history class that I was introduced to the concepts of non-proliferation and disarmament. However, my educational experience was uncommon. Only 9 students in the class were even informed about these issues. Even with this level of exposure, the curriculum presented global disarmament as a vague and unachievable aspiration. In the rare moment education covers disarmament, it is too frequently framed as an unlikely utopian dream. We encourage leaders to change that narrative by expressing a world that is possible without arms. The notion of violence is justified for global peace is contradictory. Global peace cannot and will not be established through the use of force. Unfortunately, violence through international conflict has been something people my age have been all too familiar with as we grew up. And it is unlikely to change in the near future without concerted political action. We must be proactive in acknowledging the struggles that different communities have experienced. One of the areas in which we experience violence is through growing weaponization of technology. From drone strikes to killer robots, we must reject the notion that lives are disposable through the use of inhumane technology. As young people, we are constantly told that if we would like to change the world, we have to get involved. We have the drive to help ensure tangible changes can occur in disarmament. However, if we are not giving the language to articulate our concerns, we cannot. In order for young people to be included in conversations around disarmament, there needs to be a focus on educating youth. As we took a look at the threats facing young people in non-proliferation and disarmament, we must address the importance of recognizing the ways in which LGBTQIA+ people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, people of color, and women have been disproportionately affected by the use of weapons. The challenges that Indigenous people continue to face in accessing meetings about disarmament show the lack of regard for their autonomy. By advocating for funding and institutional support of youth inclusion and disarmament education, we can change the minds of our generation and yours, and make tangible moves towards a more peaceful world. We need to be included in other conversations surrounding disarmament. We need swift action in order to see systemic changes in the area of disarmament. And we need advocates fighting for our world. Given this context, we ask the following. Language on disarmament education and youth in the outcome documents of next year's Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Review Conference and Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons meeting states parties. A commitment to inclusion of young people marginalized by gender, race, class, disability, and sexual orientation in disarmament policymaking. One place to start might be a formal recognition of Indigenous peoples, as such, not only as NGOs in disarmament forums. Institutional support and funding are critical work of educating young people on disarmament. When implementing education on non-proliferation and global disarmament, there needs to be a formal acknowledgement of other aspects of a person's identity that shape their experience with disarmament. Thank you very much for allowing us.
Let's give you the chance to fix it later. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Christian for inviting Taylor and myself to address you all today. We really value this opportunity to use our voices and be a part of the changes we hope to achieve in our lifetimes and beyond. My name is Jeremiah Williams, and I'm an undergraduate student studying political science and journalism at Pace University. I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and moved to New York in 2019 in pursuit of my bachelor's degree and a calling in public service. My perspective on disarmament work and non-proliferation education is shaped by a story of privilege and persistence. You see, my first time meaningfully encountering disarmament work was during my high school speech and debate career. I remember participating in a congressional debate competition where I role-played a position from the United States perspective on the importance of upholding the terms and conditions of the New START Treaty and encouraging Russia to do the same. At the time, it was nothing more than an opportunity to practice my public speaking abilities and to be a part of a community where motivated individuals convened and competed with passion. But at that time, I had no true grasp as to the severity of the discussions we were having. They were talking points, mock speeches, something I could easily disassociate with when I lay my head to rest at night. That is a privilege, and one that millions of people across the world at my age do not have access to, because their experiences are shaped by international violence, conflict, instability, and the existential threats of climate change and nuclear weapons. Access is the most integral component of progress. Creating and providing more purposeful initiatives and opportunities for young people like myself to engage with disarmament and nonproliferation will be the deciding factor in whether we make substantial progress on the collective issues of our time. And though many of our experiences are shaped by international turmoil, they are not defined by it. We as young people are infinitely more than our struggles. It is our persistence in spite of those struggles that helps us define who we are and what we are capable of, especially when given access to opportunity. I know personally now just how impactful those opportunities can be. This year at university, I prioritized selecting courses that would best prepare me and expose me to different approaches in a career of public service. One of those courses is Global Politics of Disarmament and Arms Control, taught by Dr. Matthew Bolton, who is here with us today. It is in my time thus far in this course that I have just begun to understand the depth of risks nuclear weapons, arsenals, and programs pose to the safety and security of the people around them. And it is intentional that we have a human-centered approach when discussing such issues. But I also know that too is a privilege. Many young people simply do not have access to private collegiate institutions that harbor such important points of access to finding the solutions to these issues. This is compounded for those of us who hold multiple identities that are historically and systematically marginalized in our communities and around the world. We must continue to find and identify and reach these communities who have an equal stake in these important conversations. The perception of youth by many governments and organized power structures is that we are apathetic and unable to meaningfully contribute to change. All talk, no action. The truth is, our voice is action, and we will continue to use it to demand accountability, advocacy, and agency to be a part of the decisions that dramatically impact our lives and our futures. In this regard, I would like to express gratitude to Sue Kim for your leadership on the Youth for Disarmament Initiative. In speaking to our class on nonproliferation education, I felt a renewed sense of hope that real progress for change is just on the horizon. It is with that I ask the following from you all. To include in every forum, conversation, and summit the voice of young people of different identities, especially from marginalized groups, and have encouraged different points of view among those individuals with different identities. Second, to advocate for the inclusion of disarmament and nonproliferation education in all agreements and treaties related to the issues of disarmament, international security, and nonproliferation. And finally, to make a personal commitment to provide young people in your lives who do not have access to forums and discussions like this one, to be included and heard in the ways you see fit to include them. We can be a part of progress, or we can sit back and say we did everything we thought of and possibly could. I encourage us to be a part of progress. Thank you.
About this young person understood about the devastating effects of the ivory trade. In other words, this young person was educated on environmental issues. So what Miguel Marin Bosch set out to do through the UN study on disarmament and nonproliferation education was to create the opportunity for young people to understand just how they understand the devastating effects of global threats to the environment, the same to do with nuclear weapons. Also, on the UN study on disarmament and nonproliferation education, there is very important avenues for youth to be involved. I was struck by his acknowledgement of that some states ask Austria, why are you so invested in nuclear disarmament? What is the passion there? Then we heard from our friends from the Marshall Islands, where it's not a luxury to be talking about nuclear disarmament. And in this event in this ongoing case of nuclear harms, nuclear testing is not a problem of the past. When the United States government exploded 67 atmospheric nuclear bombs on the island nation of the Marshall Islands, those effects are still being felt to this day. And I think that that's another importance of the involvement of youth, is that these are harms that are affecting us right now. So I think that that's very important when we negotiate the work on nuclear disarmament. And it's wonderful to be with negotiators in this room. Of course, we also know that the Marshall Islands is not only continuing to be threatened by the radioactive harms of the nuclear tests, but also by global climate chaos. And in this case, we can think about the Runit Dome, which the United States government basically dumped radioactive and toxic materials into a crater that was made on the Marshall Islands. And the dome is cracking. And that risks the contamination and further contamination of the Pacific Ocean, Oceania. When we think about youth involvement, I really want to give a shout out to Benetick, who I've been working with on a new project, the Nuclear Truth Project. And it's so delightful to be in the same room with you, because we've been on screens and in little squares together. And then to see Benetick here and to hear what you have to say, and to recognize the important work that you're doing through the Marshall Islands Education Initiative. It is shocking to think that most people in the world consider bikini a two-piece bathing suit, when in actual fact, it was the home to relatives who are present with us in this room today. The French designer that developed the bikini bathing suit in 1949 thought that that was real cute, but in actual fact, this is just a hangover of the lack of education and the willful misinformation that has been a part of the nuclear project since its very beginnings. Nuclear disruption of Marshallese bodies and lands. This horrendous chapter must be taught to the US public. I agree, Benetick. And I think that there are reparations that are due from this country to the Marshall Islands. From there, we heard from the Pace University students. And I just want to say thank you so much for centering marginalized voices in this space. It's really important for us to understand that, yes, we are more than our struggle, and also to talk about the importance of access and access to the decision-making process. You know, again, we don't want to look at youth as a sort of hang on or as something, it's not only something important to do, it's absolutely vital as we look at these issues that have a devastating effect or can have a devastating effect into the long future. I just want to say from the Columbia University presentation, something that many people may not be familiar with, which is that the first successful fission experiments in the United States happened at Columbia University. You know, they call it the Manhattan Project for a reason. A lot of the initial institutions, research, the uranium that was used in the nuclear weapons were stored in Manhattan and the outer boroughs. And for an excellent article on that, I commend Dr. Matthew Bolton's research from Manhattan Project to Nuclear Free, which you can find on the Pace University's Disarmament Institute blog. And learn about our history. Some of the youth that we work with in Hibakusha Stories, we have a project called the Radiation Detectives. And just last week, there was a group of the NYC iSchool students who were taking radiation measurements at Columbia University. And they've got a data set from the last 8 years. And I hope that there can be some way for the K1 Center for Nuclear Studies at Columbia University to look at the data that has been collected by young people here in New York who could possibly still be feeling the effects of nuclear weapons production. I think when we think about nuclear testing and we think about the Marshall Islands and what happened there and the unconscionable acts that happened to both the Marshallese people and also atomic veterans that did not realize that they were putting themselves in danger. And to think about the collaboration between some of those atomic veterans and Marshallese people here in the United States, it's very moving. But we mustn't think about ourselves as separate from that because of the nuclear testing in the Nevada test site. There is not one county in one state of the lower 48 contiguous United States that doesn't have a radiological footprint back to atmospheric testing in Nevada. So certainly not as severely impacted as the people of the Marshall Islands, who not only deserve an apology, but as I said, deserve reparations and proper cleanup of future catastrophes, such as the undoing of the Runit Dome. But we are also affected, and we are also a part of that because of the history of atomic testing, because of the secrecy, lies, and deception that the whole nuclear project has been built upon. In the UN study on disarmament and nonproliferation education, there's a very important distinction, which is it's not education about disarmament. You know, as much as that history is important, but it is education for disarmament. It's how we create a world in which disarmament is a necessary right, a human right, that we live in a world that doesn't have a nuclear suicide belt around it to be detonated by some of the most powerful nations on the planet, but to bring us back to that idea of cost, how we can create a culture of care and a culture of mutual responsibility to undo the nuclear project and create a world in which we recognize our radical interdependence and that we can work and live together. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody and thank you all for being here. Thank you all for the work that you do to bring about a nuclear weapon-free world. And good luck with your ongoing proceedings at the UN, those of you who are involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you everyone for coming to the Yale Club for this event. And this includes this really fantastic event on reverse trend and youth empowerment. Thank you once again.